In 1768, after Bostonians had demonstrated they would not remain passive, the British sent troops to occupy the city.
Both sides created tension in the years between 1768 and 1770 when the Boston Massacre took place. The British came in, many of the soldiers who weren't paid enough tried to get jobs in town, which hurt Americans who were trying to get those same jobs. They drove up the cost of housing. They drove up the cost of food. Americans, on the other hand, did not exactly receive these troops with open arms. They had always been suspicious of standing armies in time of peace. That was one thing that was not allowed in England, and yet here it was happening in America. Tensions arose, barroom brawls, taunting, just general unease. Nobody was happy with those troops.
You damned rascally scoundrel, lobster son of a bitch!
On the night of March 5th, 1770, a roving band of young Bostonians came upon a lone red-coated sentry. The mob started taunting the British soldier, hurling objects, snowballs, and insults.
Kill him! Kill him! Knock him down!
The sentry called for help, and the situation quickly escalated.
Damn your bloods! I'll make a lane through you all!
Fire! 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 Damn you! Damn you! You can't kill us all!
The soldiers tried to use their bayonets to establish some breathing room as the crowd continued to push forward.
My lads, they will not fire!
It is true that the soldiers had been severely provoked when the so-called massacre occurred, but nevertheless, when all was said and done, 5 Americans were dead, and they were killed at the hands of British soldiers. And the propaganda value of that incident was tremendous, in the hands particularly of people like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. Samuel Adams went to him and asked him to make an etching of the Boston Massacre, which you'll have in practically every U.S. history book today. And Revere said that he wasn't there, and Adams said, well, I wasn't there either, but I'll tell you what it looked like.
It was a great source of propaganda. Paul Revere created a really graphic poster, broadside as they called them at the time, showing coffins and showing a highly exaggerated image of what supposedly had gone on in King Street in Boston. What he printed was nothing like what really did happen. But it was a great way of spreading the word elsewhere that the British meant business and the colonists were in danger.
You've got the huge, huge soldiers, and you've got the colonists kind of all going back like this, like they're being attacked without any provocation at all. And you've got a little dog that's playing in the background. So, I mean, it looks as though you've got innocent liberty being attacked by ferocious, tyrannical power. And that's exactly the picture that Samuel Adams wanted people to get.
An effective and favorite tactic of revolutionary protest against British actions was to boycott products in general from England. And the kinds of products that Americans were in the habit of buying from England tended to be domestic products, products for the household, textiles, tea, things that would be useful for not only men to use, but for women to use as well. And so there was a gendered dimension to the boycotts, and women were asked to show their support and solidarity for the revolution by refusing to drink tea, by signing petitions that said they would not consume tea. Tea got invested with a lot of political meaning during the American Revolution. The Townsend duties had put taxes on an enumerated list of articles that were imported into the colonies. And in response to massive colonial civil disobedience around the issues of the Townsend duties, Britain removed all of them except for the tax on tea. And the tax on tea was maintained as a reminder that Britain had the right to tax the colonies. It wasn't particularly onerous, but it became a hot political issue again a few years later.
The East India Tea Company was going broke. One of the reasons it was going broke was that Americans were not buying East India tea. Why weren't they buying it? Because there was a tax on East India tea, and to pay that would be admitting that they would accept taxation without representation.
Britain manipulated the law yet again in order to create an economic advantage for a particularly favored tea company.
They passed something known as the Tea Act, which reformed the way that tea was brought into the colonies, made it cheaper to buy tea from England. The English assumed that if you could make them buy cheap tea, they would be willing to do it because they were convinced that all the colonists were cared about was pocketbook issues anyway. American patriots saw this as a bribe, which it was, and as a result, the Boston Tea Party occurred, and the beginning of the end really was at hand.
In New York City, a crowd of 2,000 stood in the rain to demonstrate support for a total ban on tea. In Philadelphia, the Sons of Liberty proclaimed any merchant trading East India tea an enemy to his country. In Charleston, mounds of unsold tea piled up because tea agents had abandoned their posts in fear. And in Boston, on the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men led by Samuel Adams dressed up as Mohawk Indians and sneaked aboard a cargo ship in Boston Harbor. There they spent 3 hours dumping 342 chests of tea into the drink.
We were all throwing tea overboard. We catch someone in our party trying to stuff some of the tea in his pockets. He is stripped of his booty and his clothes, and we send him home naked in disgrace. Then we went home in an orderly fashion. Boston enjoys the most peaceful night that it's had in many months.
This was how George Hughes, one of the participants, remembered the Boston Tea Party. However, Lord Lyttelton of England saw it otherwise.
Now, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, you have no government, no governor. You have only the proceedings of a tumultuous and riotous rabble.
The British Parliament, furious about the insurrection in Boston, passed a series of punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts. The colonists, however, dubbed them the Intolerable Acts.
The Coercive Acts were passed specifically to get Boston in particular and Massachusetts in general. The English were furious at the Boston Tea Party. To be fair, a lot of American colonists were taken aback by it at first, until the Coercive Acts, and then they changed their minds and saw Bostonians as heroes. People looked at what happened to Massachusetts and said, man, if it can happen there, it can happen to us. We've got to do something about this. And as a result, they met at the First Continental Congress to try to figure out how to respond to the Coercive Acts.
Committees of correspondence got the word out, and in September 1774, every colony except Georgia sent delegates to a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. During the 7-week-long meeting, the delegates passed a series of resolutions outlining what they perceived their rights to be. They resolved to boycott British goods, set up a Continental Association to enforce that resolution, and agreed to meet again the following spring for a second Continental Congress. The delegates, all leaders in their communities, were motivated by different objectives. The Massachusetts patriot Sam Adams wanted a full-scale denunciation of all parliamentary control of the colonies. By contrast, Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania sought to cool the inflammatory talk of revolution and patch up relations with the mother country. George Washington, who had seen firsthand the vast promise of the land west of the Appalachians, was ready to raise and lead an army, if necessary at his own expense. The high-minded John Adams carried with him a vision of a new society based on merit rather than social status. But it was the great orator Patrick Henry who expressed the crucial idea that was fast becoming a reality.
The distinction between Virginians and New Englanders is no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American.
The movement towards colonial unity that had begun in Albany in 1754 was solidified with the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In a mere 20 years, the players, the strategies they were willing to employ, and even the rules of the game had changed. As a result, a national consciousness had emerged. The colonists were no longer willing to be cast in the role of pawns. They saw themselves as knights prepared to do battle in the name of liberty, even if this meant openly checking the authority of their king.
The Albany Congress in 1754 was an attempt to unify the colonies in the threat of a serious war, but it didn't work. By 1774, we have moved through 20 years of increasing political activity, an increasing politicization of not just the leaders in the American colonies, but men in the streets as well, and women as well, who had participated in boycotts. There was a great deal more information available in print, in pamphlets, in newspapers, and through demonstrations about the constitutional issues at stake. Some sort of unification, loosely considered, seemed the only reasonable response to England.
They saw themselves as Englishmen in 1754. By 1774, they were saying, we can't be virtually represented. We are too different from you. There are things about us that you don't understand. We don't trust you. And as a result, I think people were, if not ready for independence, certainly not ready to embrace England with that wholehearted sense of we're all in the same family that they had been 20 years earlier.
I'd say that once Parliament decided in 1766 that its own dignity and prestige and power were at stake, and that this was a fundamental issue in terms of what it meant to be a British person, the American Revolution probably was inevitable, because by that point, most people on the western side of the Atlantic had a different understanding of being British than did people in Great Britain.
In retrospect, things do look inevitable. Given the series of events, given the cultural attitudes of people on both sides, it's hard to look back and see a way out of this. There were statesmanlike proposals made to try to prevent the breakup of the empire, and they get rejected on both sides.
If you were standing in 1765, you would not think an American Revolution was inevitable. By 1775, it clearly was inevitable, I think. And as we look back on it from our time today, boy, how could it have worked out differently?